The worst humiliation of my life didn't happen because someone yelled at me. It happened because an entire room watched me realize I was never supposed to be there. The rain had been falling for hours by the time I found myself sitting alone on a cold metal bench outside Bellamy's Steakhouse in downtown Manhattan. Water dripped from the edge of the awning above me, tapping against the sidewalk with a rhythm that felt strangely personal. My mascara was probably ruined. My hair definitely was. But neither of those things bothered me anymore. 20 minutes earlier, I had been sitting inside one of the most expensive restaurants I had ever entered, believing I was on the first promising date I'd had in nearly 3 years. Now I was trying to remember exactly when the evening had started falling apart. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old. I teach 3rd grade at a public elementary school in Brooklyn. My life isn't glamorous. Most days are filled with lesson plans, construction paper projects, and trying to convince 8-year-olds that fractions are not a form of punishment. But I love what I do. I always have. Maybe that's why my best friend Olivia convinced me to give dating another chance after my last relationship ended. You spend all your time taking care of everyone else, she had told me. Maybe it's time someone took care of you. So when Jason Reed matched with me online, I agreed to meet him. His profile made him seem successful but approachable, smart, funny, the kind of man who had his life together. Looking back now, I wonder if the warning signs were there from the beginning, and I simply chose not to see them. I arrived 10 minutes early. The hostess led me through a dining room glowing with golden light and polished marble. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath elegant chandeliers. Conversations floated softly through the room. Everyone looked wealthy. Everyone looked confident. Everyone looked like they belonged. Everyone except me. I remember smoothing the sleeves of my navy blue dress and reminding myself to breathe. Then Jason arrived. At first, everything seemed normal. He smiled. He complimented my dress. He ordered an expensive bottle of wine I couldn't pronounce. I thought maybe Olivia had been right. Maybe this would be the start of something good. But as the minutes passed, little things began to change. Jason talked constantly about himself, his investment firm, his penthouse apartment, his luxury vacations. Every story somehow ended with a reminder of how successful he was. Whenever I tried to talk about my students or my work, his attention drifted. His eyes wandered across the room. His smile tightened. By the time dinner arrived, I felt less like a date and more like an audience. Still, I tried. I kept smiling. I kept asking questions. I kept hoping the version of him from his profile might eventually show up. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Inside, the restaurant glowed warmer than ever. Around us, couples laughed quietly over candlelight. Somewhere near the back of the room, a piano played soft jazz. It should have felt romantic. Instead, a strange knot tightened in my stomach. Then Jason leaned back in his chair, glanced around the room, and asked a question that made my heart sink. "So tell me something, Emily," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Have you ever felt out of place around successful people?" I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. But something about the way he looked at me made it clear he wasn't. And in that moment, without realizing it, the worst night of my life had just begun. I remember staring at him for a second, convinced I had misunderstood the question. The restaurant noise continued around us. Silverware clinked against plates. Glasses touched. Quiet laughter drifted through the warm air. Yet somehow everything sounded farther away than before. "I am not sure what you mean," I said carefully. Jason smiled again, but there was something different about it now. Something sharper. "Come on," he said. "You have to notice it. Look around." Against my better judgment, I glanced across the dining room. Men in tailored suits discussed business over expensive whiskey. Women wore designer dresses and jewelry that probably cost more than my annual salary. The entire place felt like a different world from the classroom, where I spent my days helping 3rd graders memorize multiplication tables. "Everybody comes from different backgrounds," I replied. "That does not really matter." Jason chuckled softly. "That is exactly what people say when they know they are on the outside." The knot in my stomach tightened. I took a sip of water and forced myself to stay calm. Maybe he was trying to impress me. Maybe this was some awkward attempt at conversation. I wanted to believe that because the alternative was becoming harder to ignore. "I actually like my life," I said. "Teaching is important to me." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Important," he repeated. "Sure. But do you ever wish you had aimed a little higher?" The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, because they sounded sincere. As if he genuinely believed my career was something unfortunate that needed correcting. I thought about my students. I thought about Ava finally learning to read full paragraphs after months of struggling. I thought about Marcus proudly solving a math problem on his own for the first time. I thought about the drawings taped to my classroom wall and the handmade thank you cards sitting in a drawer at home. No, I answered quietly. I do not. Jason leaned back and shook his head. That is fascinating. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, it somehow got worse. Every topic circled back to money. Every story became another opportunity for him to compare his success to everyone else's. At one point, he mentioned a luxury condo overlooking Central Park and laughed when I admitted I had never been inside one. Later, he asked where I vacationed and looked genuinely confused when I told him I usually spent summers visiting family in Vermont. That is your idea of a vacation, he asked. I laughed politely, hoping to move on. He did not. You really are different from the women I usually meet. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. Not because it sounded complimentary, because it did not. Across the room, thunder flashed behind the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. Rain streamed down the glass in silver rivers. For a moment, I focused on that instead of him. Then the check arrived. Relief washed through me. The evening was almost over. I could thank him for dinner, go home, and forget this entire experience ever happened. Jason picked up the leather folder and glanced at the total. Then he laughed, actually laughed, loud enough that several nearby tables looked over. Heat rushed into my face. What? I asked. He looked directly at me. Do you realize this dinner costs more than some teachers make in a week? A few people nearby had definitely heard him now. I could feel it. The subtle shift in attention, the uncomfortable curiosity. My chest tightened. I think that is enough, Jason. But he was not finished. No, seriously. I am trying to picture it. How many parent-teacher conferences does it take to earn a meal like this? More laughter. This time only from him. My fingers tightened around my napkin beneath the table. Every instinct told me to stand up and leave. Yet something held me there. Pride maybe. Hope maybe. The foolish belief that he would suddenly realize how inappropriate he sounded. Instead, he shook his head and smiled toward the room. I guess some people are just more comfortable dreaming about success than actually achieving it. And somewhere in the restaurant, 3 tables away, a man who had not spoken a single word all evening slowly lifted his eyes from his glass and looked directly at our table. The words seemed to hang in the air long after Jason finished speaking. I could feel people pretending not to listen while listening anyway. The couple at the next table suddenly became very interested in their wine glasses. A waiter paused for half a second before continuing toward the kitchen. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. The embarrassment settled over me like a heavy blanket. I stared at Jason, searching for some sign that he understood how inappropriate he sounded. Instead, he looked amused, as if humiliating someone was simply another form of entertainment. You know what? He said, lifting his glass. I actually respect teachers. I do. Somebody has to do it. He took a sip and smiled. I just could never imagine settling for that kind of life. The knot in my chest tightened further. For a moment, I thought about arguing, about defending my career, about explaining that success meant different things to different people. But suddenly I felt exhausted, not physically, emotionally. I realized I was spending more energy trying to earn his respect than he had spent offering basic kindness. That realization hurt more than anything he had said. Outside, rain continued sliding down the massive windows overlooking the city. The lights of Manhattan blurred into streaks of gold and white beyond the glass. Somewhere nearby, the piano player transitioned into another soft jazz melody. Everything remained beautiful. Everything remained elegant. Yet I had never felt more out of place. Jason leaned forward slightly. Can I be honest? He asked. Before I could answer, he continued. When I saw your profile, I thought maybe you were underselling yourself. I blinked. What does that mean? I thought maybe you had bigger ambitions. He shrugged casually. Maybe something more impressive. The way he said impressive made my stomach turn. Teaching children is impressive, I replied quietly. Maybe to you. The words landed like ice water. I felt my face grow warm, not from shame anymore, from disappointment. This man was not just arrogant. He genuinely measured human worth by income, status, and appearances. And somehow he expected everyone else to do the same. He glanced around the restaurant again. Look around, Emily. These people built something. They took risks. They achieved things. I followed his gaze. Business executives, entrepreneurs, investors, successful people enjoying expensive dinners. But then I thought about my students again. The little boy who stayed after class every day because reading terrified him. The girl who brought me a handwritten note after her parents divorced because she needed someone to talk to. The dozens of children whose futures were still being written one lesson at a time. Achievement came in many forms. Jason simply could not see beyond his own reflection. I think we value different things, I said. His smile returned. That is probably true. Then he laughed softly and shook his head. Honestly, I should have realized it sooner. Something about his tone made my pulse quicken. Realized what? That this was never really going to work. For the first time all evening, complete silence settled between us. Not awkward silence. Final silence. The kind that arrives when a door closes. I nodded slowly. You are probably right. His expression changed, just slightly. I do not think he expected agreement. He expected me to defend myself, to seek approval, to argue for another chance. Instead, I reached for my purse. Emily. I looked up. What? He smiled again, but there was an edge beneath it now. Do not take this personally. We just live in different worlds. The sentence should not have hurt, yet somehow it did. Maybe because it revealed exactly what he thought of me. Not as a person, as a category. A background character who accidentally wandered into the wrong scene. I stood from my chair. My hands were steady now. The embarrassment had faded. In its place was something much stronger. Self-respect. You are right about one thing, I said. We do live in different worlds. Jason looked pleased with himself. Then I continued. In mine, people do not treat others this way. The smile disappeared from his face. Around us, the restaurant seemed to pause again. Not because anyone was openly watching, because somehow they all sensed the moment had changed. I picked up my purse and prepared to leave. And that was when I noticed him for the first time. 3 tables away, sitting alone, dark suit, broad shoulders, completely still. A crystal glass rested untouched near his hand. His expression revealed nothing, yet his eyes were fixed on our table. Calm, unmoving, observing everything, and for reasons I could not explain, the moment our eyes met, I had the strange feeling that this story was far from over. For a second, I forgot about Jason entirely. There was something unsettling about the man sitting alone across the room. Not frightening, not exactly, just impossible to ignore. He looked like someone who belonged in places like this. Someone completely comfortable, surrounded by wealth, influence, and attention. Yet he was not talking to anyone. He was not checking his phone. He was not scanning the room like everyone else seemed to be doing. He was simply watching. And somehow that felt more powerful. I looked away first. My pulse had already been through enough that evening. The last thing I needed was to invent mysteries where none existed. Jason cleared his throat. Well, he said, glancing toward the check. I guess that settles that. His tone suggested he thought he had won something. I almost laughed. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet. What are you doing? He asked. Paying for my dinner. He stared at me as if I had said something absurd. Do not be ridiculous. I am serious. I opened the folder and calculated my portion. The number made me wince internally. But that was not the point. I would rather pay for my own meal than owe anything to this evening. For the first time all night, Jason looked genuinely annoyed. Emily, you are being dramatic. The irony almost made me smile. Maybe. I placed my credit card inside the folder and closed it. But I am still paying for my dinner. The waiter appeared a moment later. He accepted the folder politely and disappeared without comment. Around us, conversations continued. The restaurant had moved on. At least most of it had. I could still feel those eyes occasionally. The man across the room remained seated, calm and unreadable. Jason leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. You know, this is exactly why people struggle financially. I blinked. Excuse me? Pride. He shook his head. People would rather make emotional decisions than practical ones. I stared at him for several seconds. Then something surprising happened. I stopped feeling hurt. The embarrassment faded. The disappointment faded. Even the anger faded. All that remained was clarity. I finally saw him exactly as he was. Not a villain, not some terrible person. Just a man so obsessed with status that he could no longer recognize character when it sat directly across from him. Somehow that realization made me feel lighter. The waiter returned carrying the folder. He handed it directly to me. Your payment has already been taken care of, miss. Confusion washed over me. That cannot be right. The waiter offered a professional smile. It has already been handled. Jason frowned. By who? The waiter hesitated. For the briefest moment, his eyes shifted toward the far side of the dining room, toward the man sitting alone. Then he quickly looked back at me. I am sorry, sir. I cannot discuss guest information. My heart skipped. Jason turned immediately, following the direction of the glance. The man remained seated exactly where he had been before. One hand rested against his crystal glass. His expression never changed. If he noticed the attention, he gave no sign of it. Do you know him? Jason asked. No. And that was the truth. I had never seen him before in my life. Jason looked irritated now, deeply irritated. The kind of irritation that comes when someone unexpectedly loses control of a situation. "Forget it," he muttered. "Let us go." But there was no us anymore, not after tonight. I picked up my purse and stood. "Goodbye, Jason." He looked surprised. "That is it, that is it." Then I turned toward the exit. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows. The piano played somewhere behind me. I had almost reached the front doors when a sudden hush moved through part of the restaurant. Not loud, not dramatic, just noticeable enough to make people glance up. Curious, I looked back over my shoulder. The man who had been sitting alone all evening had finally risen from his chair. And judging by the expressions spreading across the room, everyone seemed to know exactly who he was. I should have walked out immediately. Looking back, that would have been the normal thing to do. But something about the reaction inside the restaurant stopped me. It was subtle. No one gasped. No one pointed. Yet the atmosphere shifted the moment that man stood up. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Even the staff seemed suddenly more alert. I found myself lingering near the entrance, one hand resting on the brass door handle while rain streaked down the glass outside. Curiosity got the better of me. The man moved through the dining room with calm, measured steps. He was tall, maybe 6'3", wearing a dark charcoal suit that fit perfectly without looking flashy. There was nothing exaggerated about him. No dramatic gestures. No raised voice. Yet people instinctively made room for him as he passed. That alone told me more than any introduction could have. Jason noticed it too. I could see the confusion on his face from across the room. A few minutes ago, he had been the loudest person in the restaurant. Now he looked strangely uncertain. The man stopped beside Jason's table. From where I stood, I could not hear every word. The piano continued playing softly. Glasses clinked. Rain tapped against the windows, but I caught enough to understand what was happening. "Good evening, Jason." The man's voice was calm. Deep, controlled. Jason immediately stood. Damien. The name meant nothing to me at the time. Yet the way Jason said it sounded different from everything else he had said all night. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the confidence. For the first time since I met him, he sounded careful. Damien Romano nodded once. "I hope you enjoyed your evening." Jason forced a smile. "Of course." Damien's expression never changed. Interesting. Even from 20 feet away, I could feel the weight behind that single word. Jason glanced around awkwardly. "I did not know you were here tonight, clearly." Silence followed. Not hostile silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Something else. The kind that happens when one person understands far more than the other. I should have left. Instead, I found myself watching. The same way everyone else seemed to be watching. Damien looked toward the empty chair where I had been sitting. Then he looked back at Jason. "You know," he said quietly, "I have always believed that character reveals itself when there is nothing to gain." Jason laughed nervously. "I am not sure what you mean." Damien smiled slightly. It was the first smile I had seen from him all evening. Somehow it felt more intimidating than anger would have. "I think you do." Another silence. Longer this time. Across the room, the manager suddenly appeared beside a group of diners and personally greeted Damien with obvious respect. Damien acknowledged him with a brief nod before returning his attention to Jason. It was becoming increasingly clear that this was not an ordinary businessman, not an ordinary guest. There was influence around him, real influence, the kind that did not need to announce itself. Jason shifted his weight. "If this is about some misunderstanding, it is not." Damien's voice remained perfectly calm. "I simply find it unfortunate when people mistake status for value." My breath caught. The words felt oddly familiar, like he was responding to everything that had happened at that table. Jason looked uncomfortable now, very uncomfortable. "I did not mean any disrespect." Damien glanced toward the entrance, toward me. Our eyes met for the second time that evening. Just briefly. Long enough for me to realize something surprising. He was not looking at me with pity. He was not looking at me as someone who needed rescuing. If anything, there was respect in his expression. Respect. After the night I had just endured, it felt almost unbelievable. Then Damien looked back at Jason. "Good." His voice was quiet. Because respect costs nothing. And somehow those 3 words left the entire restaurant silent. The silence did not break immediately. It lingered across the dining room like the final note of a song. Damien Romano stood beside the table without raising his voice, without making a scene, yet somehow everyone seemed aware that something important had just happened. Jason swallowed hard and forced another smile. "Of course," he said. "Respect matters." Damien studied him for a moment, not aggressively, not judgmentally, simply observing. It reminded me of the way I watched my students when they were trying to solve a difficult problem. patient, quiet, certain. Then Damien gave a single nod. I am glad we agree. That should have been the end of it. In fact, I think Jason desperately wanted it to be the end. But the universe had other plans. The restaurant manager appeared again, this time accompanied by two executives I vaguely recognized from magazine articles. All three greeted Damien personally, not casually, not politely, respectfully. One of them even waited for Damien to finish speaking before saying a word. Jason noticed it. Everyone noticed it. The realization seemed to spread across his face in stages. First confusion, then curiosity, then something closer to alarm. I did not realize you knew the owners, Jason said carefully. Damien's expression remained unchanged. I know many people. The answer revealed nothing, yet somehow it revealed everything. Jason laughed nervously. Small world. Damien looked toward the rain-covered windows. Smaller than most people think. For reasons I could not explain, that sentence stayed with me. Maybe because it sounded less like a response and more like a warning. Not a threat. Just a reminder that actions have a way of traveling farther than we expect. Near the entrance, I finally pushed the door open. Cool air rushed inside. The storm had softened into a steady drizzle. I should have walked away immediately. Instead, I glanced back one final time. Damien's eyes found mine almost instantly. It was strange. The room contained dozens of people, yet it felt as though he noticed everything. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he inclined his head slightly. A simple gesture, respectful, nothing more. Yet after the humiliation of the evening, that small acknowledgement felt unexpectedly meaningful. I returned the nod and stepped outside. Rain kissed my cheeks as I walked toward the sidewalk. Yellow taxi lights reflected across the wet pavement. The city hummed around me. Traffic, distant sirens, footsteps, life moving forward exactly as it always did. My phone buzzed inside my purse. Olivia, of course, I answered immediately. How was the date? She asked. I laughed before I could stop myself, not a happy laugh. The kind people make when they are too exhausted to explain something properly. Terrible? She guessed. That obvious? Emily, you only make that sound when something has gone spectacularly wrong. I started walking toward the subway station. You have no idea. As I told her what happened, I expected the embarrassment to return. Instead, I felt oddly calm. Maybe because the night was finally over. Maybe because I knew I would never see Jason Reed again. Or maybe because one unexpected moment had changed the way I remembered the evening. Olivia listened quietly until I finished. Then she said, "Wait, who paid for your dinner?" I slowed my pace. Rain tapped softly against my umbrella. I do not know. And this mysterious stranger defended your dignity without asking for anything? When she said it like that, it sounded almost unbelievable. Pretty much. Emily, what? That does not happen every day. I looked back toward the glowing restaurant one last time. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could still see figures moving inside. Damien Romano was nowhere in sight, gone as quietly as he had appeared. No, I admitted softly, I guess it does not. What I did not know then was that the night was not over. Because inside Bellamy's Steakhouse, Jason Reed had just asked a question that would change everything. Who exactly is Damien Romano? The answer came almost immediately. One of the executives standing nearby looked at Jason as though he had just asked why the sky was blue. You seriously do not know? Jason forced a laugh. Should I? The executive exchanged a glance with the restaurant manager. Neither seemed eager to continue the conversation. That alone made Jason more uncomfortable. People who spent their lives discussing power usually enjoyed talking about powerful people. The fact that no one wanted to elaborate told him everything he needed to know. Finally, the manager spoke carefully. Let us just say, Mr. Romano is someone whose opinion carries a great deal of weight. Jason frowned. In what industry? The manager smiled politely. Several. Then he excused himself and walked away. Jason stood alone beside the table, staring toward the entrance where I had disappeared minutes earlier. For perhaps the first time that night, he looked uncertain about his own judgment. Meanwhile, I was halfway downtown on the subway. The train rattled through dark tunnels while rainwater streaked across the windows. Most passengers stared at their phones. A few slept. I leaned my head against the cool glass and replayed the evening for what felt like the 100th time. Normally, humiliation lingers. It settles into your memory and refuses to leave. But strangely, that was not what stayed with me. What stayed with me was the moment someone I had never met looked at me with respect when the person sitting across from me could not. That difference mattered more than I wanted to admit. By the time I reached my apartment in Brooklyn, it was nearly midnight. My building was old. The elevator made noises that sounded vaguely threatening. The hallway lights flickered. Usually I found the imperfections comforting. Tonight they felt even more welcome. Real life, honest life. I kicked off my shoes, changed into sweatpants, and made myself a cup of tea. Then my phone buzzed. Olivia, of course, I answered immediately. How was the date? She asked. I laughed before I could stop myself. Not a happy laugh. The kind people make when they are too exhausted to explain something properly. Terrible? She guessed. That obvious? Emily, you only make that sound when something has gone spectacularly wrong. As I told her what happened, I expected the embarrassment to return. Instead, I felt oddly calm. Maybe because the night was finally over. Maybe because I knew I would never see Jason Reed again. Or maybe because one unexpected moment had changed the way I remembered the evening. Olivia listened quietly until I finished. Then she said, "Wait, who paid for your dinner?" I slowed my pace as I walked from the station toward my building. Rain tapped softly against my umbrella. I do not know. And this mysterious stranger defended your dignity without asking for anything. When she said it like that, it sounded almost unbelievable. Pretty much. Emily, what? That does not happen every day. I looked back toward the glowing skyline one last time. No, I admitted softly. I guess it does not. Across the city, Damian Romano sat in a conference room reviewing proposals from the Romano Educational Foundation. It was something he did every month. Literacy programs, scholarship initiatives, school renovations, community grants. Most of the applications blended together after a while. But one folder remained open on the table long after the meeting ended. Public School 118, Brooklyn, a literacy program that had exceeded expectation despite limited resources. The proposal included classroom reports, student outcomes, and letters from faculty members. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents: Emily Carter. Damian recognized it instantly. The same teacher from Bellamy's, the same woman who had spent an entire evening defending the value of her work. He opened one of the recommendation letters and read a sentence that made him pause. Miss Carter has personally built reading support plans for students who would otherwise be left behind. Damian leaned back in his chair. Suddenly, the determination in her voice at the restaurant made perfect sense. She had not been defending a job. She had been defending a purpose. He closed the folder and looked through the window at the city lights beyond. The school had already been under foundation review weeks before Bellamy's. The grant committee had recommended approval. Emily's name was already in the reports long before he ever heard her speak. Yet somehow meeting her had transformed a file into a person, a real one. And for the first time in a very long time, Damian found himself genuinely curious about someone he had not expected to remember. The report was only 3 pages long. Damian Romano read every word anyway. Not because there was anything extraordinary about Emily Carter on paper. Quite the opposite. She was ordinary in all the ways that seemed increasingly rare. 27 years old, elementary school teacher. No scandals, no lawsuits, no carefully manufactured image. Just years of consistent work, volunteer programs, student recommendations, and a reputation for showing up when people needed her. Damian closed the folder and stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. Below him, Manhattan moved with its usual relentless energy. Traffic crawled through intersections. Construction cranes stretched across the skyline. Thousands of people chased deadlines, meetings, opportunities, and ambitions. Yet somehow, his thoughts kept returning to a woman who taught multiplication tables in Brooklyn. A knock interrupted the silence. "You wanted the final approval documents, sir?" his assistant asked. Damian nodded. "Leave them." She placed a folder on his desk and hesitated. "The school grant?" Damian glanced down. Public School 118, Brooklyn. The same proposal that had been moving through the foundation review process for nearly 2 months. The committee had already recommended approval before Bellamy's. The board had already voted. The funding package was scheduled to be announced the following week. Everything had been decided long before he ever met Emily Carter. "Everything is ready?" Damian asked. "Yes, sir. The announcement goes out Monday morning." Damian nodded once. "Good." The assistant left. Alone again, he opened the folder. Student literacy scores, classroom assessments, teacher recommendations, community impact reports. Emily's name appeared throughout the documents, not because she had requested attention, because her work kept appearing in the results. He closed the file and returned his gaze to the city skyline. Across town, I knew nothing about any of this. My week unfolded the way most weeks did. Monday became Tuesday. Tuesday became Wednesday. I taught lessons, graded assignments, supervised recess, and spent one afternoon helping a struggling student finish a reading project he was convinced he could not complete. Life felt normal again. Bellamy's had started to feel like a strange story that happened to someone else. Then Monday morning arrived. I walked into school carrying a cup of coffee and a stack of spelling quizzes. The hallway buzzed with unusual excitement. Teachers gathered in small groups whispering. Office staff smiled at one another. Something was happening. "Did you hear?" Megan from 4th grade asked the second she saw me. "Hear what?" "The grant." I blinked. "What grant?" She stared at me in disbelief. "The Romano Foundation grant." My stomach tightened immediately. Not from fear, from surprise. Before I could ask another question, the loudspeaker crackled overhead. Principal Harrison's voice called the building. "All faculty members, please report to the library before first period." Minutes later, the entire staff sat gathered among shelves of aging books and worn furniture. Principal Harrison stood at the front holding an official letter. Her excitement was impossible to miss. "Several weeks ago," she began, "the school submitted an application for educational funding." Several teachers nodded. Apparently everyone knew except me. "Last month, we were informed that our proposal had advanced to the final review stage. This morning, we received official confirmation." She paused for dramatic effect. "The Romano Educational Foundation has approved a major grant for our school." Applause erupted throughout the library. Teachers cheered. Some looked genuinely emotional. I sat frozen, not because the news was bad. It was incredible. The funding would help hundreds of students. Yet I could not ignore the name attached to it. Romano. Principal Harrison continued explaining the improvements: new technology, expanded literacy programs, library renovations, resources the school had needed for years. Everything suddenly made sense. The grant had not appeared because Damien met me. The process had already been underway long before Bellamy's. The timing was simply a coincidence. Or at least that is what I told myself. The meeting ended, classes resumed, life moved forward. But by the end of the day, curiosity returned. I searched the foundation website again. This time I noticed something I had missed before. A photograph from a recent board meeting. Damien Romano stood beside the foundation directors. Beneath the image was a short caption identifying him as chairman of the organization. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then a knock sounded at my classroom door. "Come in," I called. The door opened slowly. Principal Harrison stepped inside. Behind her stood a tall man in a charcoal suit. My breath caught instantly. Damien Romano, standing inside my classroom, as though the city itself had suddenly become much smaller. For a moment, I simply stared at him. My classroom suddenly felt unreal. Construction paper stars hung from the ceiling. Crayon drawings covered the bulletin boards. Tiny desks sat arranged in neat rows. It was the last place I ever expected to see Damien Romano. Principal Harrison seemed completely unaware of the storm currently happening inside my head. "Mr. Romano specifically requested to see the literacy program," she said. "And when he learned one of our teachers had helped develop it, he wanted to meet her personally." I somehow managed to smile. "That is very kind." Damien's gaze never wavered. "I have heard good things about your work, Miss Carter." His voice sounded exactly the same as it had at Bellamy's. Calm, measured, controlled. Yet standing inside my classroom, surrounded by student artwork and spelling charts, he seemed different somehow. Less distant, more human. Principal Harrison excused herself a few minutes later to handle another meeting, leaving the two of us alone. The silence that followed felt surprisingly comfortable. Damien slowly walked through the room, stopping occasionally to examine student projects displayed on the walls. "These are impressive," he said. "My students would be thrilled to hear that." He smiled slightly. "I suspect they already know." I found myself laughing. A real laugh this time. The first one in days. Damien stopped beside a display showcasing handwritten essays. "You care about them?" It was not a question. "Of course I do. Most people say that." His eyes moved across the student work. "You prove it." For some reason, those words affected me more than they should have. Perhaps because they came from someone who had no reason to say them. No reason except honesty. We walked through the library next. Teachers and staff greeted Damien respectfully. Students waved. He waved back. Nothing about his behavior felt performative. He listened when children spoke. He asked questions. He paid attention. By the time the tour ended, my assumptions about him had changed completely. Eventually, we found ourselves standing near the front entrance of the school. Afternoon sunlight spilled across the polished floor. Students were beginning to leave for the day. Parents gathered outside. The normal rhythm of life continued all around us. "I owe you a thank you," I said quietly. Damien looked surprised. "For what?" "The restaurant." He studied me for a moment. "You do not owe me anything. You paid for my dinner." That was not why. I hesitated. Then why? For the first time since meeting him, Damien seemed to choose his words carefully. Not because he was hiding something. Because he wanted to get it right. Finally he spoke. I was not helping you because I felt sorry for you. The noise of students and parents faded into the background. Somehow those words felt important. Then why? I asked again. His eyes held mine, steady, honest, unwavering, because you were the only person in that room who still had dignity. My breath caught. No grand speech, no dramatic declaration, just the truth, simple and direct. The kind of truth that stays with you long after the conversation ends. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. We did not need to. Somewhere outside, a school bus pulled away from the curb. Children laughed. Teachers said goodbye. Life moved forward, yet something had shifted. Something neither of us could fully explain. Damien glanced toward the parking lot where a black sedan waited. I should go. I nodded. Thank you for visiting. A faint smile touched his face. I have a feeling this will not be my last visit. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. I watched him leave. The sunlight caught the glass doors as they closed behind him. And standing there in the hallway of a Brooklyn elementary school, surrounded by the ordinary life I loved, I realized something unexpected. The most powerful man I had ever met was not the one who made people feel small. He was the one who reminded them how much they were worth. And that was the moment my life changed forever.